In the winter of 1866, in a province still shaped by snowbound villages, church bells, and candlelit homes, government officials went door to door across Quebec with a simple task: count the living. Names were written down. Ages were asked. Relationships were recorded. Births, deaths, and family structures were neatly arranged into columns that would later be bound into ledgers and stored away as historical truth. At the time, no one imagined that these dry pages of census data would one day raise questions so disturbing that they would challenge the very limits of human biology. Because hidden within those official records, documents meant to be factual, sober, and unquestionable, were births that should not have been possible. Women listed as giving birth at ages when fertility had long ceased. Children recorded as being born years after their fathers were already dead. Siblings whose ages overlapped in ways that defied pregnancy itself. These were not rumors, not folklore, not whispered legends passed down through families. They were entries written in ink by the state. Signed, stamped, filed, accepted as truth. And that is what makes this story unsettling. When strange events appear in oral tradition, we can dismiss them as exaggeration or myth. When they appear in religious texts, we can attribute them to symbolism or belief. But when they appear in a government census, one designed to regulate taxation, land ownership, and social order, the implications become far darker. Either the records were catastrophically wrong, or the society that produced them was hiding something so deeply that even reality itself was rewritten on paper. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what a census represented in the 19th century. It was not merely a demographic exercise. It was an assertion of control, a way for the state to define who existed, who belonged, and who did not. To be counted was to be acknowledged as real. To be miscounted, or deliberately altered, meant your existence could be reshaped to fit social expectations. In 1866 Quebec, truth was not always the highest priority. Survival was. This was a world governed by rigid morality and overwhelming religious authority. Birth was not simply a biological event, it was a moral judgment. The circumstances of a child's arrival could determine whether they would be accepted, hidden, or erased. Illegitimacy carried lifelong stigma. Adultery was a social death sentence. Incest was unspeakable. And for women, especially poor rural women, pregnancy outside the narrow boundaries of acceptability could mean exile, forced adoption, or worse. Against this backdrop, the census taker arrived. He asked questions that many families were afraid to answer honestly. How old are you? How many children do you have? When were they born? Who is the father? In a society where memory was often oral, ages were estimated, dates were guessed, and names were reused after infant deaths. But some of the answers recorded went far beyond approximation. They crossed into the impossible. A woman listed as 58 years old, with a child marked as 2. Another marked as 63, with an infant. Boys and girls born months apart to the same mother. Children appearing in the household years after a husband's burial had already been documented by the church. These were not single errors. They appeared repeatedly, across villages, parishes, and regions. At first glance, it is tempting to dismiss them as clerical mistakes. After all, literacy was limited. Enumerators were overworked. Language barriers between French-speaking villages and English-speaking officials caused confusion. But when historians began to examine these records closely, a troubling pattern emerged. The errors were not random. They clustered around specific circumstances: unmarried women, widows, large impoverished families, and households already marked by previous deaths. Which raises a disturbing possibility. These entries were not mistakes at all. They were intentional distortions. To alter a birth date was to alter a narrative. To shift a child's age could hide illegitimacy. To assign motherhood to an older woman could conceal a daughter's pregnancy. To list a deceased husband as the father of a child born years later could preserve family honor and prevent church punishment. On paper, biology could be bent. Time itself could be rearranged. And the census accepted it. What makes this even more unsettling is that these records would later become the foundation of modern genealogy. Family trees were built on them. Lineages were traced through them. Identities were inherited from them. For generations, descendants trusted these documents as objective truth, never realizing that their origins might be rooted in fear, secrecy, and fabricated timelines. There is also a quieter, more haunting question buried beneath the data. How many real lives were erased to make these impossible births appear normal? Infant mortality was devastatingly high in 19th century Quebec. Many children died within days or weeks, never baptized, never named, never recorded. Sometimes their names were later reused for another child, creating the illusion of overlapping births. Sometimes a child was absorbed into another identity entirely, raised as a sibling rather than a son or daughter. Sometimes a pregnancy was hidden so thoroughly that the official record had to invent a past that never existed. In that sense, the census did not just record life, it rewrote it. The deeper historians dig into the 1866 census, the clearer it becomes that these impossible births are not anomalies to be brushed aside. They are cracks in the facade of order that the state and the church worked so hard to maintain. They reveal a society where truth was negotiable, where paper could protect reputations better than honesty, and where survival often required bending reality itself. And yet, no official inquiry was ever launched. No correction was issued. The census was accepted, archived, and preserved. The impossible became official. Today, when we look back at these records with modern medical knowledge, we know with certainty that many of these births could not have occurred as written. Menopause does not pause for social convenience. Pregnancy cannot overlap itself. Death cannot precede conception. Biology is unforgiving. But history, it seems, is not. What the 1866 Quebec census leaves us with is not a single mystery, but many. Who decided these lies were necessary? How widespread was the deception? And how many stories of shame, coercion, and loss remain buried beneath neat rows of ink and paper? This is not just a story about bad record keeping. It is a story about what happens when a society values moral appearance over human truth. When official documents become instruments of silence. When the state records what people needed to believe, not what actually happened. Because once a lie is written into history, it doesn't disappear. It multiplies. It passes from generation to generation. And long after the people who told it are gone, the impossible remains, quietly waiting in the archives, daring someone to notice that it was never meant to make sense at all. By 1866, Quebec was a land suspended between old-world tradition and a modern future that had not yet arrived. For most of its population, life was dictated not by government offices or distant capitals, but by the rhythms of the land and the authority of the church. Villages were small, scattered, and often isolated by geography and winter. Roads were unreliable, travel was slow, and for many families, the world extended no further than the parish boundary. In this environment, personal history was not preserved in official documents so much as it was carried in memory, ritual, and reputation. Faith was the organizing force of everyday life. The Catholic Church did not simply guide spiritual belief, it governed morality, family structure, and social legitimacy. Birth, marriage, and death were sacred events, and they were recorded first and foremost in parish registers. These records were considered moral documents as much as administrative ones. A child born within wedlock was not merely legitimate in a legal sense, but clean in the eyes of God and community. A child born outside marriage, however, carried a stain that could follow them for life. That stigma extended to the mother, the extended family, and sometimes the entire household. For women, the stakes were especially high. Pregnancy was visible, unavoidable, and deeply scrutinized. A married woman was expected to bear children regularly, yet quietly. An unmarried woman who became pregnant faced humiliation, exclusion, and pressure to repent publicly. In some cases, she could be forced to give up her child. In others, she might be sent away temporarily to hide the pregnancy, only to return with a rewritten story about where the baby came from. These were not rare events. They were understood, unspoken mechanisms of social control. Medical knowledge in 1866 was limited and often filtered through religious interpretation. Concepts like menopause, fertility windows, and reproductive health were poorly understood outside academic circles, and even there, knowledge was incomplete. Midwives relied on experience and tradition rather than science. Doctors were scarce in rural regions, and many births occurred without any trained medical supervision at all. As a result, the precise recording of ages and birth dates was often an approximation. People counted years by harvests, winters, or major events rather than calendars. A woman might not know her exact age, only that she was about 50 or past her childbearing years, as defined by community perception rather than biology. This vagueness created space for manipulation. If age was fluid, then it could be adjusted. If memory was the authority, then memory could be reshaped. And in a society where written records were becoming increasingly important, but had not yet replaced oral tradition, there was a dangerous overlap between what was true and what was convenient. Life itself was precarious. Infant mortality was tragically common. Many children died before their first birthday, some before they were even baptized. Stillbirths and miscarriages were often not recorded at all, or were mentioned only briefly in parish notes, if at all. Families learned not to speak too openly about children until they had survived their earliest years. Names were reused frequently, especially if a previous child bearing that name had died. To the modern eye, this practice creates confusion and overlapping identities. To the people of the time, it was an act of continuity and hope. Poverty compounded everything. Large families were common, not because life was abundant, but because survival demanded it. Children were labor. They worked the land, cared for animals, and supported aging parents. Losing a child was not only an emotional blow, but an economic one. Yet feeding many mouths was difficult, and hunger was never far away. Malnutrition affected fertility, health, and lifespan, but these factors were poorly understood. Death, when it came, was often attributed to God's will rather than physical causes. Within this fragile system, reputation mattered more than precision. A family standing in the community could determine access to work, marriage prospects, and mutual aid. To be whispered about was dangerous. To be openly condemned was catastrophic. As a result, families learned to present a version of themselves that aligned with moral expectations, even if it meant quietly adjusting the truth. This was not seen as deception in the modern sense, but as discretion. Silence was a form of protection. The state, meanwhile, was becoming more present in people's lives, but it was still distant and impersonal. Census takers were outsiders, often unfamiliar with local families, dialects, and customs. They relied on heads of households to provide information, and rarely challenged what they were told. The assumption was that people would tell the truth. In reality, people told a version of the truth that would not harm them. The intersection of church authority and state administration created a peculiar tension. Parish records held moral weight, but census records held bureaucratic power. When the two conflicted, families often tried to make them align, or at least not openly contradict one another. If a child existed who could not be easily explained within acceptable timelines, the solution was not to confront the reality, but to alter the narrative. A birth date could be shifted backward or forward. A mother's age could be increased. A widow could quietly become a mother again, on paper, even if biology disagreed. It is also important to understand how time itself was experienced. Without widespread clocks or standardized calendars in daily use, time was elastic. Seasons blurred together. Years were remembered in relation to births, deaths, or disasters. This made precise chronology less important than continuity. As long as a family story made sense socially, exact dates were secondary. All of this created an environment where official records could drift away from biological reality without immediate consequence. The census was not scrutinized by doctors. It was not cross-checked with medical knowledge. It existed to count souls and labor, not to verify reproductive possibility. As long as the numbers added up and the households appeared stable, no one questioned whether the story was physically plausible. But beneath this surface order was a quiet accumulation of distortions. Each small adjustment, an age altered here, a birth year shifted there, added another layer between reality and record. Over time, these layers hardened into accepted history. What began as survival strategies became permanent entries in official archives. The world of 1866 Quebec was not one of deliberate fraud, but of constrained choice. People operated within a system that punished honesty when it conflicted with moral norms. In such a system, the impossible did not stand out. It blended in. A woman giving birth at 60 did not immediately raise alarms, because questioning it would require questioning the family's honor, the church's oversight, and the census itself. This is the context in which the impossible births of the 1866 census must be understood. Not as isolated absurdities, but as products of a society where truth was shaped by faith, fear, and necessity. Where biology took a backseat to reputation. Where history was written not by what happened, but by what could safely be admitted. And once those admissions were written down, they became something far more dangerous than rumors. They became official. At the heart of the 1866 census anomalies were not abstract numbers or ink-stained columns, but families, ordinary households whose private lives were quietly folded into official records. These were farming families, widows, laborious, and multi-generational homes clustered around parish churches and narrow strips of land. From the outside, they appeared unremarkable. Yet when their census entries are read closely, patterns emerge that suggest something deeply unsettling beneath the surface of domestic normalcy. Many of these households followed a familiar structure: an aging couple, several children still at home, perhaps a grandparent or unmarried aunt living under the same roof. But woven into these family lists were details that did not align. A mother whose age placed her well beyond childbearing years, yet listed with an infant. A teenage girl absent from the household during the year of a recorded birth, only to return months later with a new sibling. A widower recorded as the father of a child conceived long after his burial was noted in parish death records. These contradictions were subtle enough to pass unnoticed at the time, yet stark when examined together. In many cases, the anomalies cluster around young women of the household. Daughters whose ages suggest they were biologically capable of pregnancy, but who never appear as mothers in the record. Instead, the role is assigned to an older woman, often the girl's own mother. On paper, the family remains intact, respectable, and free from scandal. In reality, the census may be recording a carefully constructed fiction designed to shield a younger woman from lifelong stigma. These arrangements required silence, cooperation, and endurance. A grandmother claiming maternity of her own grandchild had to maintain the lie publicly for years. The child would grow up calling their biological mother sister, their grandmother mother. This was not an invention unique to Quebec, but the census provides rare, unintentional glimpses of how frequently it may have occurred. Each impossible birth suggests not confusion, but coordination. There are also families where the same name appears twice with conflicting ages, hinting at the reuse of identities after death. Infant mortality was so common that a child who died young might barely be acknowledged beyond the immediate family. When another child was born, the name would be given again, as if continuity could undo loss. But in the census, this practice collapses time. Two children appear to exist simultaneously under one identity, producing records that suggest overlapping births and impossible timelines. Widows present another recurring pattern. In multiple households, a woman is listed as widowed for several years, yet suddenly appears with a newborn child. In a society where remarriage was common and documented, the absence of a new husband raises questions. The census often attributes the child to the deceased spouse, preserving the appearance of legitimacy. On paper, the family's moral standing remains untouched. In reality, the child's origins are erased. These households were bound together by necessity as much as affection. Extended families lived under one roof because survival demanded cooperation. Privacy was limited. Secrets were shared by everyone or no one. For a fabricated narrative to hold, every member of the household had to play their part. Children learned early which questions not to ask. Outsiders were given only what they needed to know. The census taker rarely probed beyond surface answers. He did not ask how a woman past 60 conceived. He did not question how siblings were born within months of each other. He wrote what he was told. In doing so, he unknowingly preserved these domestic fictions in permanent form. Some families, however, present patterns that are harder to explain through social concealment alone. There are households where multiple impossible births occur over decades, involving several women and children. In these cases, historians have considered whether chronic misreporting of age could be responsible. In communities where birthdays were not celebrated and calendars were secondary, ages drifted over time. A woman recorded as 60 might have been younger. A child listed as 2 might have been 4. Yet even with generous margins of error, some entries remain biologically implausible. This has led researchers to consider darker possibilities: hidden abuse, coerced pregnancies, incest concealed beneath layers of altered documentation. In such cases, assigning maternity to an older woman would not merely protect reputation, it would bury evidence. The census, intended to illuminate population data, instead becomes a tool of erasure. The emotional toll of such arrangements is impossible to measure. Children raised under false identities carried confusion they may never have articulated. Women forced into silence bore shame they could not name publicly. Men listed as fathers of children they never knew, or never existed, became part of narratives that outlived them. None of these stories appear explicitly in the census. They are implied, encoded in contradictions. What makes these family entries particularly haunting is their ordinariness. There is no dramatic language, no sign of conflict or scandal. Just names, ages, relationships. The horror lies in what is not said. The census speaks in the calm, indifferent voice of bureaucracy, even as it records lives twisted to fit moral expectations. Generations later, descendants tracing their ancestry encounter these families and feel something is wrong. Dates do not align. Ages shift inexplicably. DNA tests reveal relationships that contradict recorded lineage. The impossible births of 1866 resurface not as historical curiosities, but as personal mysteries. Each anomalous household represents a negotiation between truth and survival. These families were not attempting to deceive future historians. They were trying to endure their present. The census captured a snapshot of that struggle, freezing it in time without context or explanation. What emerges from these family records is not evidence of chaos, but of adaptation. People shaped their recorded identities to fit a system that punished deviation. Biology became flexible on paper. Time became malleable. Parenthood became assignable. The census, rather than exposing these distortions, absorbed them. In this way, the families at the center of the 1866 census are both victims and architects of the impossible. Their lives reveal how deeply social pressure can warp recorded reality. They remind us that history, even when written in official ink, is often less about what happened and more about what could safely be acknowledged. And in the quiet contradictions of these households, the impossible was allowed to pass as normal, so long as no one asked how it could be true. Among the most disturbing entries in the 1866 Quebec census are those involving women whose recorded ages place them far beyond the biological limits of childbirth. These are not marginal discrepancies or minor miscalculations. They are cases in which women listed as being in their late 50s, 60s, and in a few instances even older, appear as mothers of infants or very young children. On paper, these women gave birth at an age when the human body is no longer capable of conception. And yet the census records them without hesitation, without annotation, without question. Even by the standards of the mid-19th century, such births would have been extraordinary. While medical science at the time lacked today's precision, the concept of fertility ending with age was not unknown. Midwives, priests, and physicians alike recognized that women eventually ceased menstruation and childbearing. Menopause was not medically defined in modern terms, but it was socially understood. A woman described as past her time was expected to no longer bear children. When a census lists a woman of 62 with a newborn, it is not reflecting ignorance, it is reflecting something else. What makes these cases particularly unsettling is their frequency. These are not one or two isolated households that could be dismissed as clerical mistakes. They appear repeatedly across different parishes and regions. The ages vary, but the pattern remains consistent. Older women suddenly re-entering motherhood after decades without recorded births. In many cases, these women already have adult children listed in the same household, sometimes only a few years younger than the supposed newborn. The biological implausibility is stark. One of the most common explanations offered by historians is age misreporting. In a society where precise birth dates were rarely known, ages could drift over time. A woman listed as 60 might have been 50. A census taker might have misunderstood an answer or recorded it incorrectly. But when researchers adjust these ages generously, subtracting 10 years, even 15 in some cases, the problem does not disappear. The women remain too old to plausibly give birth, especially repeatedly. Another explanation often proposed is the reassignment of motherhood within families. When a younger woman became pregnant under circumstances that threatened family honor, the child could be claimed by an older female relative. Most commonly, this would be the grandmother. On paper, the older woman becomes the mother. The younger woman becomes a sister. This arrangement protected the family from scandal, preserved marriage prospects, and satisfied the moral expectations of the church. But such arrangements required extraordinary commitment. The older woman had to publicly accept motherhood again, despite her age. She had to answer questions, endure scrutiny, and maintain the story consistently. That many women appear to have done so suggests how severe the consequences of exposure must have been. The census entries hinted a culture where the social cost of truth was higher than the cost of biological impossibility. There are also cases where the recorded ages suggest a woman gave birth before puberty or immediately after. Girls listed as mothers at 10 or 11 years old appear rarely, but when they do, they present a different kind of horror. These entries are often dismissed as clerical errors, but in a society where abuse was rarely acknowledged and almost never recorded, they cannot be ignored. If such ages are even approximately accurate, they point to violence that was never named. The census offers no commentary. It does not flag these births as unusual. It simply records them alongside thousands of others. This silence is part of what makes the record chilling. The state did not intervene. The church did not object. The impossible was absorbed into the administrative machinery without resistance. In some households, the pattern of impossible motherhood repeats over multiple census cycles. A woman listed as giving birth in her late 40s, then again in her 50s, then again in her 60s. Each time, the child is recorded as legitimate, part of the same household, without any acknowledgement of anomaly. Over time, these entries accumulate into a record of extended fertility that defies all known biological limits. Such patterns raise the possibility that age itself was being strategically inflated. If a woman's age was deliberately recorded as older than it truly was, assigning her motherhood would appear more plausible. But this strategy only works to a point. When ages exceed even generous margins of error, the illusion collapses. Yet the census does not correct itself. What becomes clear is that the census was not designed to detect biological truth. It was designed to record social structures as they were presented. If a household claimed that an older woman was the mother, the census accepted it. There was no medical verification, no cross-reference with parish birth registers at the time of enumeration. The system trusted appearances. These entries force us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Official records can preserve falsehoods with remarkable efficiency. Once written, they gain authority. Later generations treat them as fact, even when they contradict natural law. For the women involved, these records represent lives lived under immense pressure. Whether they were protecting daughters, concealing abuse, or simply navigating a world that offered no safe alternative, their choices were constrained. The census did not capture their fear or their reasoning. It captured the result. Today, when genealogists encounter these impossible mothers, they often attempt to resolve the contradiction by adjusting dates or assuming errors. But in doing so, they risk repeating the same erasure that occurred in 1866. By smoothing over the impossibility, the underlying human story is lost once again. The presence of these women in the census challenges our assumptions about historical reliability. It reminds us that even the most official documents are shaped by human needs and anxieties. Biology may be fixed, but history is negotiable. In the quiet, unquestioning ink of the census, these women appear as mothers against all odds. But behind that ink lies a world where truth was dangerous, and impossibility was sometimes the safest story available. Another layer of the 1866 Quebec census anomalies emerges when the focus shifts from mothers to children themselves. Here, the impossibilities are not tied to age alone, but to time. Entire households appear in which the recorded sequence of births collapses chronology, creating children who arrive too close together to be biologically feasible, or who seem to exist without any clear place in the family timeline at all. These are children without time, entries that suggest overlapping pregnancies, missing years, and lives that do not align with the rhythms of human reproduction. In some census records, siblings are listed with birth years separated by mere months. A child recorded as 2 years old appears alongside a sibling marked as 1, sometimes even younger. On paper, this implies pregnancies overlapping in a way that would require 2 wombs, or a body capable of carrying multiple full-term pregnancies simultaneously. Even allowing for approximate ages, the compression of time is too extreme to dismiss easily. These entries recur across different families, suggesting a pattern rather than a clerical accident. One explanation often raised is careless age estimation. Children's ages, especially very young ones, were frequently guessed. Parents might round ages down or up, or count in seasons rather than years. But again, even generous corrections fail to fully resolve the contradictions. In many cases, the spacing between births remains implausibly short, even after adjusting for error. A more unsettling possibility is the erasure of death. Infant mortality was so common that families often lost multiple children in rapid succession. When a baby died shortly after birth, the loss might not be formally recorded, especially if the child was not baptized. The emotional pain was real, but the administrative trace was often faint or non-existent. When another child was born soon after, the family might reuse the name of the deceased child. In the census, this can create the illusion of two living children with nearly identical ages, when in reality one replaced the other. This practice, while emotionally understandable, fractures the historical record. It merges separate lives into a single identity and creates chronological distortions that ripple forward. Over time, the census no longer reflects individual births and deaths, but a compressed narrative designed to preserve continuity and memory. There are also cases where children appear in households without any recorded birth context at all. A child of unknown age suddenly appears between census years, with no corresponding baptism or birth record. In some instances, the child is listed as biological offspring. In others, the relationship is vague or inconsistent across documents. These children may have been adopted informally, taken in from relatives, or absorbed into families after parental death. In a society where formal adoption was rare and poorly regulated, such arrangements were common and rarely documented accurately. Yet the census often assigns these children a place in the biological order of the family, even when that placement distorts chronology. A child taken in at age 5 might be listed as 2, to align with a supposed birth sequence. The result is a record that smooths over social reality at the expense of biological truth. Some of the most troubling cases involve children born after a supposed break in time. A woman may be listed with a series of children born in the 1840s and early 1850s, followed by a long gap, and then suddenly a newborn in the mid-1860s. While late pregnancies are not impossible, the absence of any intermediate births combined with the mother's advanced age raises questions. Was this child truly hers? Or was the census absorbing a child from another generation into the existing family structure? These gaps often coincide with periods of migration, illness, or economic disruption. Men left to work elsewhere. Women were sent away during pregnancies. Children were temporarily placed with relatives. When families reunited, the census recorded a simplified version of events. Complexity was erased in favor of coherence. In some households, children seem to move backward in time. A child listed as 10 years old in one census appears as 8 in the next. Another appears older than an older sibling. These inconsistencies suggest not only estimation error, but active adjustment. Ages may have been altered to maintain acceptable spacing between siblings or to fit labor expectations. A child listed as older could work sooner. A child listed as younger could be protected longer. The census did not record childhood as a lived experience. It recorded utility, dependency, and moral order. If altering a child's age served the family's needs, it was done. What is striking is how these distortions cluster around moments of vulnerability. Periods following death, illness, or social disruption produce the most chronological inconsistencies. Time bends where life was hardest. The census becomes a map of stress rather than a record of precision. Modern genealogists encountering these records often feel a sense of unease. Family trees refuse to align. Birth sequences contradict biological possibility. DNA evidence reveals siblings who cannot be full siblings, or parents who cannot be parents at all. The paper trail leads to dead ends that cannot be resolved through traditional research methods. For the children themselves, these distortions shaped identity. Growing up with uncertain ages, unclear parentage, or misaligned birth order affected how they were treated within the family and the community. In a world where inheritance, labor expectations, and marriage prospects were tied to age and legitimacy, these details mattered deeply. The census, however, flattened these complexities. It presented households as stable units with clear internal logic. The impossible births of children without time were absorbed into that narrative, unnoticed by officials and unquestioned by the state. What remains today is a record that challenges our assumptions about historical data. These children exist on paper in ways they may never have existed in life. Their recorded ages and birth years do not reflect biology, but negotiation. Each inconsistency is a trace of a choice made under pressure. In trying to understand these entries, we are forced to confront the limits of documentation. The census tells us who was supposed to exist, not necessarily who did. It reflects the stories families were willing or able to tell, not the full truth of their lives. The children without time remind us that history is not only written by those in power, but shaped by those trying to survive beneath it. Their impossible timelines are not accidents. They are evidence of lives lived in the gaps between truth and necessity, where time itself could be rearranged to make the present bearable and the future possible. To understand why so many families allowed impossible stories to be written into official records, it is necessary to confront the invisible forces that governed daily life in 19th century Quebec. These forces were not abstract. They were immediate, personal, and often brutal. Shame, sin, survival, and silence shaped decisions more powerfully than truth ever could. In this world, lying was not always an act of deception. It was often an act of self-preservation. Illegitimacy was one of the most feared social labels a child could carry. A child born outside marriage was marked from the moment of birth, not just by gossip, but by institutional judgment. Parish registers often explicitly identified such children, and that mark could follow them for life, limiting marriage prospects, employment, and social acceptance. The mother bore even greater consequences. She could be publicly shamed, denied communion, or pressured to confess before the congregation. In small villages, where everyone knew everyone, there was no anonymity. One pregnancy could define a woman forever. Under these conditions, altering the narrative of a birth was not just tempting, it was rational. If a child could be made to appear legitimate on paper, a lifetime of suffering could be avoided. Assigning the child to a married woman, even one far past childbearing age, preserved the family standing. The census did not ask how. It only recorded what it was told. Adultery carried its own dangers. A married woman who conceived outside her marriage risked not only social ruin, but violence and abandonment. Divorce was virtually non-existent, and separation carried heavy stigma. In such cases, a pregnancy could not be acknowledged honestly without destroying the household. Adjusting dates, reassigning parentage, or erasing a child's true origins became the only viable options. Incest, though rarely discussed, existed in silence. Overcrowded homes, isolation, and power imbalances created conditions where abuse could occur without witnesses. When pregnancies resulted, the stakes were unthinkable. There was no framework for justice, only concealment. The census, indifferent and procedural, became an unintended accomplice. By accepting altered ages and fabricated relationships, it helped bury realities that society refused to confront. Religion reinforced these pressures rather than alleviating them. The Church emphasized repentance and forgiveness, but also demanded public acknowledgement of sin. For many families, confession was not a path to healing, but a threat. Better to rewrite the story than to expose it. Better to distort biology than to invite condemnation. Women, in particular, bore the burden of these decisions. They were expected to embody moral purity while navigating a world that offered little protection. When confronted with pregnancy under unacceptable circumstances, they were often given no real choice. Silence was imposed, not chosen. Older women stepping into false motherhood roles were not seeking attention. They were absorbing disgrace to shield others. Poverty magnified everything. Poor families lacked the resources to send daughters away discreetly or arrange private solutions. They relied on collective deception. Neighbors often knew the truth, but knowing did not mean speaking. Survival depended on mutual silence. Everyone understood that today's secret could be tomorrow's necessity. The census arrived as a moment of risk. It forced families to articulate their private lives to an outsider. But it also offered an opportunity. Once a version of events was written into an official document, it gained authority. That version could be referenced, repeated, and relied upon. What began as a protective lie became a fixed identity. This is why so many impossible births cluster around moments of vulnerability. The census did not create the lies, it preserved them. It froze decisions made in fear into permanent record. Over time, these decisions hardened into history. What is most unsettling is how normalized this process appears to have been. The frequency of these anomalies suggests shared understanding rather than isolated misconduct. Families knew what could and could not be said. Census takers knew what not to question. Priests often chose discretion over confrontation. The system functioned because everyone accepted its limits. From a modern perspective, this collusion feels deeply troubling. But in context, it reflects a society where moral law was enforced without mercy, and compassion often took the form of silence. To survive, people learned to navigate between what was real and what was acceptable. These lies were not victimless. They erased identities, distorted lineages, and buried trauma. Children grew up without knowing their origins. Women carried secrets that could never be spoken. Abuse went unacknowledged. But in a world with no safety net, Exposure was often worse than silence. The census stands today as a testament to these choices. Its impossible births are not evidence of ignorance, but of fear. They are records of decisions made under pressure, where truth was sacrificed to protect the living. When we read these entries now, we must resist the urge to judge too quickly. The people behind them were not rewriting history for convenience. They were navigating a system that offered no mercy for honesty. In such a system, secrecy was not moral failure, it was strategy. The impossible births of 1866 are, in the end, less about biology than about power. Power to define legitimacy. Power to shame. Power to silence. The census did not challenge that power. It recorded its consequences, quietly and efficiently, leaving future generations to wonder how so many impossibilities could exist in plain sight. In 1866, the boundary between medical understanding and belief was thin, uneven, and often indistinct. For most people in rural Quebec, health, illness, and reproduction were not governed by scientific explanation, but by tradition, experience, and faith. What could not be understood was often explained through custom or attributed to divine will. This environment allowed biological impossibilities to exist on paper without raising immediate suspicion, because the framework for questioning them simply did not exist. Doctors were scarce, especially outside major towns. Many families lived their entire lives without ever consulting a trained physician. Childbirth was handled by midwives whose knowledge was passed down through observation rather than formal education. These women were experienced, capable, and trusted, but they worked without a scientific understanding of hormones, fertility cycles, or menopause. They knew that some women stopped bearing children, but they did not know why. When exceptions appeared, or were claimed, they were often accepted without challenge. The concept of menopause itself was poorly defined. It was understood as a gradual fading rather than a fixed biological boundary. A woman might be considered past childbearing by one midwife and not by another. If an older woman was said to have conceived, the explanation did not require biological proof. It could be framed as rare, miraculous, or simply unusual. In a deeply religious society, the idea that God could override natural limits was not controversial. Miracles were part of the cultural vocabulary. This belief system created space for stories that defied physical logic. A late-life birth could be seen as a blessing rather than an impossibility. A child born under strange circumstances might be described as God's will. These explanations discouraged scrutiny. Questioning them could be interpreted as questioning divine authority itself. Age, too, was an unreliable metric. Without standardized documentation, most people did not know their exact birth date. Ages were often estimated based on memory or comparison to siblings. Over time, these estimates drifted. A woman might gain or lose years with each retelling. When census takers asked for ages, they recorded answers as given, rarely seeking clarification. In this context, a woman listed as 60 could easily have been younger, or believed herself to be. Folk beliefs about fertility further complicated matters. Some traditions held that fertility could return after long periods, especially following illness, spiritual renewal, or prayer. Others believed that stress or hardship could temporarily suppress childbearing, only for it to resume later. While these ideas lack scientific basis, they shape how people interpreted reproductive events. A child born unexpectedly did not immediately provoke suspicion. It was absorbed into a worldview that allowed for irregularity. Misunderstandings about pregnancy itself were widespread. The duration of pregnancy was not precisely measured. Premature births were poorly understood. Twins and stillbirths blurred boundaries further. A baby born early might be assumed to have been conceived later than it was. A miscarriage might not be recognized as such. These gaps in understanding made it difficult to establish accurate timelines, even when people were acting in good faith. The Church, which might have been expected to impose clarity, often reinforced ambiguity. While it maintained parish records, it also prioritized moral order over biological accuracy. A legitimate narrative mattered more than a precise one. Priests were not trained medical professionals. They relied on what families told them. If a birth was presented as legitimate, it was recorded as such. Investigating biological plausibility was not their role. In some cases, religious language was used deliberately to shield uncomfortable truths. A child born under questionable circumstances might be described as unexpected but welcomed. A late-life pregnancy could be framed as a divine gift. These narratives discouraged further inquiry and aligned with cultural values. The census, operating within this environment, did not introduce skepticism. Enumerators were not doctors. They had no mandate to evaluate reproductive claims. Their task was to record households, not interrogate them. In a society where even medical professionals deferred to tradition and faith, expecting census takers to challenge impossible births is unrealistic. What emerges is a system where biological impossibility was not immediately recognizable as such. Without modern education or widespread scientific literacy, people did not possess the tools to question what they were told. When anomalies appeared, they were explained away through belief rather than investigation. This does not mean people were ignorant. They understood their bodies through lived experience. But lived experience is shaped by interpretation. When interpretation is filtered through religion and tradition, it can accommodate contradictions that science would reject. The result was a shared blind spot. Entire communities could accept records that make no biological sense to modern readers. These records did not trigger alarm because the cultural framework did not require them to. Over time, as medical knowledge advanced, these anomalies became more visible. But by then, they were already embedded in historical documents. The census had preserved them as fact, even as understanding evolved. For modern researchers, this presents a challenge. It is tempting to impose contemporary logic on historical records, but doing so risks misunderstanding the world that produced them. The impossible births of 1866 are not evidence of widespread confusion, but of a society operating under different assumptions about truth, authority, and the body. Folk belief and medical ignorance did not create these anomalies alone. They made them possible. They provided the cultural permission for stories that defied biology to exist without question. They softened the edges of contradiction and allowed survival narratives to pass as natural variation. In this way, belief did not merely coexist with error, it protected it. And the census, standing at the intersection of tradition and administration, recorded the result without hesitation, leaving behind a record that continues to puzzle, disturb, and challenge those who encounter it today. When the impossible births of the 1866 census are examined in isolation, they can be dismissed as coincidence, error, or the product of individual misunderstanding. But when the scope is widened, when records from multiple villages, parishes, and regions are laid side by side, a far more unsettling picture begins to emerge. The anomalies repeat themselves with striking consistency. They appear in communities that had no direct contact with one another, recorded by different enumerators, yet shaped by the same invisible pressures. This repetition is what transforms curiosity into concern. Across rural Quebec, the same patterns surface again and again. Older women recorded as mothers of infants. Siblings spaced impossibly close together. Children appearing without clear origins. Widows bearing children years after a husband's death. These are not confined to one parish or one family line. They are distributed across regions separated by distance, dialect, and local custom. The common thread is not geography, but structure. In village after village, census entries follow similar distortions. This suggests that families were not acting independently. They were responding to shared expectations. The census did not invent these patterns, it reflected them. And because the same distortions appear wherever similar social conditions existed, it becomes difficult to argue that they were the result of simple incompetence. If clerical error were the primary cause, the mistakes would be random. Ages would drift both up and down. Birth sequences would be inconsistent in unpredictable ways. Instead, the errors cluster around moral pressure points. They smooth over illegitimacy. They preserve marriage. They protect reputation. The direction of distortion is always the same. This consistency points to a systemic issue. It suggests that the census was operating within a culture that quietly encouraged certain kinds of misrepresentation. Families knew which truths could be told and which could not. Enumerators learned what not to question. Over time, a shared language of acceptable fiction developed. In some regions, entire clusters of families show similar anomalies. Multiple households within the same parish record late-life births or compressed birth intervals. This implies not only shared pressure, but shared solutions. Families were learning from one another how to navigate the census. The strategies were replicated because they worked. Historical events may have amplified these patterns. The mid-19th century was marked by economic instability, disease outbreaks, and waves of migration. Men left to work in logging camps or factories, sometimes for years at a time. Women were left managing households alone. When children were born under ambiguous circumstances, reintegration required narrative repair. The census provided a moment to formalize that repair. Parish boundaries, which defined community identity, also played a role. Each parish functioned as a moral unit. Deviance was not just personal, it reflected on the community. There was incentive to present a collective image of stability and virtue. Census entries that aligned with this image were less likely to provoke scrutiny from church or state. The repetition of anomalies also challenges the assumption that the census was a neutral observer. While it did not actively enforce falsehoods, it created a framework in which they could be safely recorded. The structure of the census, its categories, its assumptions, rewarded coherence over accuracy. A household that fit expected norms was easier to process than one that did not. When researchers map these anomalies, they often find correlations with poverty, isolation, and strong religious influence. These were not the communities with access to education or medical care. They were places where survival depended on conformity and mutual silence. The census, in capturing these communities, inadvertently captured the cost of that silence. Modern analysis also reveals that these patterns persist across time. The same families sometimes appear in later censuses with continued distortions. Once a narrative was established, it was maintained. Children grew into adults carrying identities shaped by earlier misrepresentations. Their own families inherited the consequences. What is particularly disturbing is how these systemic distortions went unnoticed by authorities. No large-scale corrections were attempted. No questions were raised about the plausibility of the data. The census was accepted as accurate because it aligned with expectations. It confirmed what society wanted to see. This reveals a deeper truth about historical records. They are not merely repositories of data. They are products of negotiation between individuals and institutions. When institutions prioritize order over inquiry, patterns of distortion can become invisible. The repetition of impossible births across villages is not evidence of mass delusion. It is evidence of a system that quietly incentivized certain narratives. People responded rationally to irrational constraints. By examining these patterns collectively, we begin to see the census not as a flawed document, but as a revealing one. It exposes the pressure points of 19th century Quebec society. It shows us where truth bent most often, and therefore where fear was greatest. The impossibilities recorded in 1866 are not isolated errors waiting to be corrected. They are signals. They point to a society that maintained stability by reshaping reality on paper. And because this reshaping was widespread, it became normalized. The extraordinary became ordinary. When viewed from a distance, the census becomes less a record of population and more a map of compromise. Each repeated anomaly marks a place where life did not fit the mold, and where the mold was forced to stretch instead of break. This is why the patterns matter. They tell us that the census did not fail randomly. It failed consistently. And in that consistency, it reveals the hidden architecture of fear, conformity, and survival that shaped an entire generation's official history. When modern historians and genealogists began revisiting the 1866 Quebec census with contemporary tools, what they encountered was not clarity, but resistance. The records refused to align. Timelines fractured. Lineages twisted back on themselves. What once appeared as authoritative history began to unravel under scrutiny, revealing that the past had been carefully edited long before anyone thought to question it. Genealogists are often the first to encounter these contradictions on a personal level. Tracing a family line back through parish registers and census data, they expect difficulty, but not impossibility. Yet again and again, researchers reach points where the math simply does not work. A woman gives birth at an age that defies biology. A child is born after a father's recorded death. Siblings appear too close together to have come from the same mother. These are not rare frustrations. They are common enough to be considered a known hazard in Quebec genealogy. Initially, most researchers assume error. Perhaps a census taker wrote the wrong number. Perhaps a priest misheard a name. Perhaps a page was damaged or copied incorrectly. But as inconsistencies multiply, the explanation of random error becomes insufficient. Adjusting one date only breaks another. Correcting one age creates a new contradiction elsewhere. The record resists correction because it was never purely factual to begin with. The introduction of DNA testing has intensified this unease. Genetic evidence now allows descendants to test relationships that were once taken for granted. In many cases, the results do not match the paper trail. Individuals believed to be full siblings turn out to be half-siblings. Parents recorded in official documents are genetically impossible. Entire branches of family trees collapse under the weight of biological proof. For some families, these revelations are deeply unsettling. Identity, heritage, and belonging are tied to lineage. Discovering that the official story is false can feel like a personal loss. Yet for historians, these discrepancies confirm what the census hints at. The records reflect social reality, not biological truth. Academic historians approach the census differently. Rather than trying to fix the data, they ask what the distortions reveal. Why were certain lies told consistently? Why were others avoided? Why does the data bend in predictable directions? In this sense, the census becomes a cultural artifact rather than a demographic one. By comparing census records with parish registers, land deeds, wills, and court documents, historians can sometimes reconstruct the underlying reality. But even then, gaps remain. Silence itself becomes evidence. Missing baptisms, unrecorded deaths, children who appear fully formed in census entries without any earlier trace. These absences speak as loudly as contradictions. Modern scholarship recognizes that the census was shaped by power dynamics. It recorded households as units of labor, morality, and order. Anything that threatened that image was smoothed out. The census was never intended to expose complexity. It was designed to impose it. This realization has changed how historians treat official records. Where once census data was treated as a baseline of truth, it is now approached with caution. Scholars cross-reference aggressively, aware that the most confident entries may be the most deceptive. Certainty itself becomes suspicious. The impossible births of 1866 also challenge assumptions about consent and agency. Who decided what was written down? Was it the head of household? The priest? The census taker? Did women have any say in how their lives were recorded? Modern analysis suggests that power was unevenly distributed, and that many recorded identities were imposed rather than chosen. For genealogists, this creates ethical dilemmas. When DNA contradicts documentation, which truth should be prioritized? Revealing hidden parentage can reopen old wounds, even generations later. Some researchers choose discretion, while others feel a responsibility to accuracy. The tension mirrors the original conflict that produced the false records: truth versus consequence. Technology has also revealed how widespread these issues are. Digitization projects have made it possible to analyze census data at scale. Patterns that were invisible in handwritten ledgers become clear in databases. Statistical analysis confirms what anecdotal research suggested. The anomalies cluster around specific social conditions and repeat with remarkable consistency. This has led some historians to argue that the census should be read as a negotiated document. It represents a compromise between the state's need for order and families' need for protection. Understanding it requires empathy as much as analysis. There is also a growing recognition that the census preserves voices that would otherwise be lost, even if those voices speak in distortion. The impossible births tell us where pressure was greatest. They point to moments of crisis, shame, or fear. They reveal where society failed to accommodate reality, forcing people to adapt in secret. Modern analysis does not resolve the mystery so much as deepen it. Each tool that clarifies one aspect reveals another layer of concealment. DNA exposes hidden relationships but cannot explain why they were hidden. Corrected timelines restore biological plausibility but erase social truth. Every answer comes at a cost. What the 1866 census ultimately offers modern researchers is not a puzzle to be solved, but a lesson to be learned. History is not neutral. Records are not passive. They are shaped by the conditions under which they are created. When those conditions include fear, shame, and survival, the record will reflect them. In confronting the impossible births of Quebec, modern historians are forced to abandon the comfort of certainty. The past cannot be neatly reconstructed. It must be interpreted with humility. The census stands as a warning to anyone who mistakes documentation for truth. It reminds us that what is written down is often what was allowed to be said. And what was allowed to be said was shaped by forces far more powerful than accuracy. In the end, modern analysis does not correct the 1866 census. It reframes it. The impossibilities are no longer errors to be fixed. but evidence to be understood. They tell a story not of ignorance, but of adaptation. Not of confusion, but of control. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they suggest that the most reliable records may be the ones that make the least sense, because only under extreme pressure does history bend far enough to break the rules of biology itself. What is most easily forgotten when examining census anomalies, timelines, and biological contradictions is the human cost buried beneath them. Behind every impossible birth, every distorted age, every rewritten relationship, there was a real person whose life was altered by necessity and silence. The census does not record fear, grief, or coercion. It does not show the emotional weight of decisions made in desperation. But those consequences linger, quietly embedded in the lives that followed. When a child's origins were altered on paper, that alteration did not remain confined to ink. It shaped identity. A child raised believing an older woman was their mother may never have known the truth, or may have sensed it without ever having it confirmed. Confusion became normal. Questions went unanswered. Curiosity was discouraged. In many families, silence itself became an inheritance. For women, especially, the cost was profound. Younger women whose pregnancies were concealed lost ownership of their own motherhood. Their children were taken from them in everything but physical proximity. They were expected to suppress attachment, to present affection as sisterly rather than maternal, to live a lifelong performance for the sake of respectability. Older women who assumed false motherhood absorbed shame that was not theirs, carrying social and physical burdens at an age when they should have been spared them. These arrangements demanded emotional discipline bordering on cruelty. Love had to be rationed carefully to avoid suspicion. Affection shown too openly could raise questions. Distance had to be maintained, even within the same household. The census lists stable families, but stability came at the cost of authenticity. Men, too, were affected, though often differently. Some were recorded as fathers to children they could not have biologically conceived, either because of death, absence, or infertility. Others were never acknowledged as fathers at all. Their roles were rewritten to fit acceptable narratives. Paternity, like maternity, became a social assignment rather than a biological fact. In cases involving abuse, the cost is even harder to confront. If a pregnancy resulted from coercion or incest, altering the record may have been the only way to avoid catastrophe. But avoidance came at a price. Trauma was never named. Accountability never occurred. The census, in preserving a sanitized version of events, also preserved injustice. Generations later, descendants inherit these distortions without knowing their origin. Family stories feel incomplete. Connections feel fragile. People sense gaps they cannot explain. Modern DNA testing often brings these buried truths back to the surface, sometimes violently. Discovering that one's recorded parent is not biologically possible can fracture a sense of self. It forces confrontation with secrets that were meant to die quietly. What was lost is not just accuracy, but continuity. When identities are altered, family histories fracture. Names are reused. Timelines blur. The ability to trace ancestry becomes compromised. But more importantly, the ability to understand one's place in a lineage is damaged. People lose access to the truth of where they came from, not because the truth was unknowable, but because it was deliberately hidden. The census also erased grief. Infant deaths that went unrecorded disappeared entirely from history. Those children lived briefly, loved briefly, and then vanished from the official record as if they had never existed. When names were reused, individuality was overwritten. Mourning became private, unsupported by acknowledgement. This erasure compounds over time. When history relies on records that smooth over pain, suffering becomes invisible. The struggles of women, the vulnerability of children, the reality of abuse and desperation, all are lost beneath orderly columns. The census presents a calm surface that conceals emotional wreckage. There is also a moral cost. When systems reward conformity over truth, they teach people that honesty is dangerous. This lesson does not end with one generation. It becomes cultural. Silence becomes a skill. Adaptation becomes instinct. The census reflects not just individual choices, but a collective understanding that survival requires distortion. Modern readers may feel tempted to judge these decisions harshly. But judgment misses the point. The real tragedy is not that people lied. It is that they had to. That the social, religious, and legal structures of the time left no safe space for truth. that the cost of honesty was often higher than the cost of rewriting reality. What was lost, then, was possibility. The possibility of living openly. The possibility of recording lives as they truly were. The possibility of future generations understanding their past without contradiction. The impossible births of the 1866 census are reminders of that loss. They are evidence of lives lived under pressure, identities shaped by fear, and histories rewritten to protect the present at the expense of the future. When we read these records today, the challenge is not simply to correct them, but to listen to what they are telling us beneath the inaccuracies. They tell us where society failed to care for its most vulnerable. They tell us where compassion was replaced by concealment. They tell us that history, when stripped of context, can appear orderly while hiding profound harm. The human cost of falsified history is not abstract. It echoes in confused family trees, in unresolved trauma, in questions that surface generations later with no one left alive to answer them. What was lost cannot be fully recovered, but it can be acknowledged. And in acknowledging it, we confront a deeper truth, that the most damaging lies are often the ones told not out of malice, but out of fear, because fear, when embedded into systems, has a way of shaping history itself.